One of the most disturbing and shocking parts of history is the fact that many royal vaults have been broken into over the years and centuries, and they were desecrated. In Scotland, for example, in Holyrood Abbey, the bones of former Scottish kings were even scattered by warring English troops, and today they are collected inside of one large coffin. But even many of the coffins and tombs within Westminster Abbey and St George's Chapel have been broken into and disturbed, with queens such as Elizabeth I or Mary Queen of Scots even having their vaults investigated. In this history documentary, we look at 5 royal vaults which were disturbed and opened, and discover what was found inside of these. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. It was Henry III who rebuilt Westminster Abbey to honour Edward the Confessor, whose relics and body were placed in a burial vault and shrine in the centre of the abbey. Around this, many of the kings and queens of medieval England are buried in large tombs and shrines. Most of the kings and queens of England from Edward the Confessor's time onwards, until the death of King George III in 1760, are buried at Westminster, including most of the Tudors, excluding Henry VIII, the victor of the Wars of the Roses, Edward IV, and the executed King Charles I, who are all buried close to each other inside of St George's in Windsor. Following George III's death, most monarchs were buried in Windsor. But the tombs of the kings and queens of Westminster Abbey have been opened a number of times throughout the years. There are 17 English, Scottish and British monarchs buried in the abbey, and the final 2 buried with full tomb effigies are Elizabeth I and the executed Mary, Queen of Scots. We will now explain some of the burial vaults inside of Westminster Abbey and the tombs, and what happened when these were opened. One of the most powerful medieval monarchs to rule over England was Edward I, who is often known as the Hammer of the Scots. Edward was a warring king, but he was very well respected. But following his death in July of 1307, his body was taken to Westminster Abbey in burial. Edward I's corpse had been well prepared, and he wrapped tightly in a cerecloth, which was renewed with wax years later. His tomb was opened in 1774, 4 centuries after his death, and what was discovered was remarkable. It was said that the chin and lips were entire, but without any beard. A sinking or dip between the chin and the upper lip was very conspicuous. Both the lips were prominent, the nose short, as if shrunk, but the apertures of the nostrils were visible. There was an unusual fall or cavity on that part of the bridge of the nose which separates the orbits of the eyes, and some globular substance, possibly fleshy part of the eyeballs, was movable in their sockets under the envelope. Edward I had been buried in some rich clothes which had also survived very well, and it was said that over the cerecloth was a tunic of red silk damask, above that a stole of thick white tissue crossed the breast, and on this, at 6 inches distant from each other, quatrefoils of filigree, work of gilt metal, set with stones, imitating rubies, sapphires, amethyst. Edward I's tomb itself is a vault, and he is interred within this, and it is very different to other kings' tombs, as it is not covered with an effigy, and instead is very plain. Buried close to Edward I is Henry V, the skilled commander of the English at the Battle of Agincourt. Henry died whilst in France, and his body was then repatriated back to England, and he was interred inside of Westminster Abbey on the 7th of November 1422. His funeral was huge, and he wanted a chantry chapel to be built over his tomb, and this is what happened. Still today, Henry V's body is kept in the vault under this tomb, and the vault under the chantry chapel that was built around it, and this tomb does stand out when compared to others. It is more lavishly decorated, and on top of the tomb is a lifelike effigy of Henry V that does show the king in a very close resemblance to portraits of him, and this was probably made from his funeral effigy, which was placed on top of his coffin. Henry V's tomb was opened in 1953, over 500 years after his death. It's not known why his tomb was opened, but some work previously had been done around the tomb, and it was discovered that the body of another man was interred practically in the same vault as Henry. The reality of this was that the work had disturbed the floor of Henry V's Chantry Chapel, and found within, nearby in a stone-lined grave, holding a crozier and a gold ring, was the body of Richard Courtenay, the Bishop of Norwich and close friend of Henry V. Henry V had him buried in the abbey, and it may have been stipulated that the king wanted his close friend buried nearby. It would also have been rude not to mention the fate of King Henry V's queen, Catherine of Valois. Catherine was left unburied for 400 years, and her remains were even shown to tourists inside of the abbey, and Samuel Pepys, the diarist, kissed the remains of the deceased queen on his birthday, seeing this as a rather morbid birthday present, defiling the dead. She was left in a box, disinterred for centuries. It's not known why she was not interred in the vault of her husband, Henry V, and it may have been due to her second husband being the grandfather of King Henry VII, and the Tudor king wanted to distance himself from Catherine of Valois and Owain Tudor, her husband. Catherine's coffin was buried eventually, moved, and it was buried within a vault under St Nicholas's Chapel in 1778, and her remains were then moved to a permanent burial site under a new altar created in Henry V's chantry. This burial spot, her final burial spot under the altar in a vault, contains an inscription which states, "Under this slab, once the altar of this chapel, for a long cast dawn and broken up by fire, rest at last, after various vicissitudes, finally deposited here by command of Queen Victoria, the bones of Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, King of France, wife of Henry V, mother of Henry VI, grandmother of Henry VII, born in 1400, crowned 1421, died 1438. When Henry VII created the Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey, he probably dreamed of it becoming a huge Tudor mausoleum for centuries, but just over 100 years after his victory at Bosworth battlefield, the death of his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would bring the end of the Tudor dynasty. The reality of the Lady Chapel's quest to become a Tudor mausoleum is rather successful, especially as Henry VII, Elizabeth of York, Mary I, Elizabeth I, and Edward VI are buried there, or at least nearby. The only Tudor monarch buried elsewhere is Henry VIII, who did intend to be buried back in Westminster Abbey, but in a huge and grand vault with a colossal tomb and effigy being placed above. The tomb of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, his queen, is very much the centrepiece of the Lady Chapel, and underneath the tomb is a burial vault. This burial vault contains today the remains of not just the king and queen on the effigy of the tomb, but there is also a Stuart king buried there too. When the Lady Chapel was finished, Elizabeth of York, the first Tudor queen, was buried inside of the vault at the heart, and the tomb was then placed on top following the death of Henry VII. The first Tudor monarchs were laid to rest for many decades until the burial vault of the pair would be disturbed with the death of the final Tudor queen, Elizabeth I. As a tribute to the glory of Elizabeth I's reign, she was interred in this burial vault, but she wouldn't be laid to rest there for too long. She was then later taken out of the vault and was placed into a different vault which is around 10 metres away. Her coffin was then buried in the vault of her half-sister Mary I, who is commonly known as Bloody Mary. The tomb today only shows Elizabeth I in all of her royal regalia and glory, and there is only a small plaque showing that Mary I is buried there. This says, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of resurrection." But inside of this burial vault, the coffins of Elizabeth I and Mary I are placed on top of each other, with Elizabeth on the top, showing that she was more important than her half-sister, even in death. The coffins are still left in this way, and also in the burial vault is a small vessel, presumably a lead-lined tin, which contains the hearts of Elizabeth I and Mary I, which were removed after death during the embalming process. One young boy, even whilst he was in the vaults, allegedly touched this and claimed, "Within niches were the urns, one with the name Queen Mary, the other with that of Queen Elizabeth. I dipped my hand into each and took out each of a king of gluttonous red substance, somewhat resembling mortar. Mary's urn contained the least moisture. He had touched the heart of the last Tudor queen." The burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York was then later opened again, and this was done to inter the body of King James I following his death, the successor of Elizabeth I and the first Stuart monarch. The reason James I was buried there was probably as he wanted to be compared with the founders of the previous dynasty, as he was the first Scottish king to rule over England too. It is known that to get the body of James I into the burial vault, that the wooden coffins of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had to be removed, meaning that still today their tightly wrapped remains in the cerecloth are left inside of the burial vault. James I's body was also left in this way. Also buried in a side chapel nearby is the mother of James I, the executed Mary Queen of Scots. She is buried in a large vault under her tomb and effigy, and inside of this vault are many other members of the Stuart royal family who were buried inside there following their deaths. So Westminster Abbey does not have one central burial vault, but instead it has many different burial vaults that house the remains of kings and queens and other high-ranking members of nobility. Some of these vaults contain incredibly wealthy and powerful people from the centuries previous, but the burial vaults are mostly scattered around the Lady Chapel, and the tombs of the medieval kings and queens mostly contain their remains, and they are not necessarily entombed inside of a vault.
The royal vault that sits under St George's Chapel today is considered full or close to it, with the coffins of dozens of royals and minor royals inside of it. But what is this, and what does it look like? As a building, St George's Chapel is known as a royal peculiar. It is a building that is under the direct authority of royalty and the monarchy, and it does not necessarily fall inside of a parish. Over the centuries, it became a place where many people were interred and buried, and there were many different chapels that were created inside of St George's for smaller worship and dedication to royals. A chapel was made in Windsor Castle's walls and was rededicated to George the Martyr, but it then became known as St George's Chapel. Throughout the Wars of the Roses and the early Tudor period, there was extensive redevelopment to the building, but during the English Civil War, there was a lot of destruction in the building. There was pillaging and plundering by parliamentarian forces, but following the execution of King Charles I, the executed king was buried there, alongside Henry VIII, who had been buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, in a specially built vault. Further changes and restoration was made throughout the reigns of the Georgians and Queen Victoria. One of the first monarchs buried inside of St George's was Edward IV, and it stated that he was to be buried in a vault with a chapel or closest over it, with space for an altar and a tomb with his figure of silver and gilt, or at least copper and gilt. The will further provided for a chantry of 2 priests and for the company of 13 poor bedsmen to live within the college. The king's bones were left for a number of centuries, but they were then discovered when work was done to repair and change parts of St George's to the wishes of King George III. Edward IV had been buried inside one of the first royal vaults, and the vault itself was small, 9 feet long and under 4 feet wide, and it had a number of arches in it. The remains of a wooden coffin with the skull and bones of Elizabeth Woodville lay on top of a lead coffin, and these had been put in there. The coffin of Edward IV was opened, and his complete skeleton was found, and even shoulder-length brown hair was found on his head. One eyewitness claimed that, When the coffin was opened, the body bore its natural form but soon fell to powder. The point of this is that there were actually a number of individual burial vaults for the royals found inside of the chapel. However, King George III ordered the excavation and building of a proper royal burial vault underneath the floor of the chapel. This became known as the tomb house, and inside of this vault are a number of different shelves which are held behind iron bars, and today there are 25 bodies of members of the royal family who are buried in their coffins in this part of the royal vault. The bodies are literally slid onto the shelves and then have been left in this manner. One of the first people to be buried in the royal vault was Princess Charlotte in 1817, and she died following giving birth. The tomb house holds the remains of many different royals, including King George III, George IV, William IV, and many of their grandchildren, children, and other family members. The first to be interred in the royal vault was Princess Amelia in 1810, the daughter of George III and his wife Charlotte. There is near to the shelf a few central plinths, and these, the coffins of a number of kings and queens, were placed in the centre, highlighting their importance. Some images of the royal vault even show the coffins carrying a number of crowns. Throughout the centuries, there were some rearrangements and changes to the royal vault, and different monarchs could stipulate the arrangements and organisation of the different coffins. Some had coffins placed on the racking at the side, and others had closer relatives on the plinths in the central point. With regards to gaining access to the royal vault, there is one which is accessed by a staircase for those who have clearance, for example the priests who regularly go and pray down there, but the other entry is through an elevator or a lift mechanism in the central part of the chapel, and this is a hole in the floor which comes up and down, bringing coffins into the royal vault. Coffins are lowered to a chamber below, and this is connected to the royal vault. When the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II took place, the body of the Queen was lowered symbolically into said royal vault, using the electronic lift. Her incredibly heavy coffin was then brought back out of the vault hours after the funeral had taken place, because she was to be buried inside of a small chantry chapel alongside her father, King George VI, and her mother. The remains of Elizabeth II were then interred here. Philip, her consort, Prince Philip as he was better known, had his coffin held inside the royal vault for roughly a year, and this was done so that there would not be two separate interments inside of the memorial chapel. Someone must have known that the Queen did not have long left, or the plan was to always hold Philip's body in the royal vault before burying him with his wife together. The process for burials inside of the royal vault was as followed. The funeral service would take place inside of St George's Chapel, followed by the committal, and this would see the coffin being lowered into the royal vault using the lift fitted into the chapel near to the altar. The coffin was then either placed on the central part of the vault, or it was stored away on the different shelvings held behind the iron railings. The vault itself is believed to have been rather cool. It is not refrigerated, leading to the conclusion that the remains tend to stay in a good sense of preservation due to the temperature. There are other small vaults as mentioned, but these are not the actual royal vault, for example Henry VIII's vault, and also Elizabeth II's.
Following the death of Queen Elizabeth I, the Scottish monarchs became the rulers of England, and many Stuarts are buried today inside of Westminster Abbey, inside of the vaults there. This includes James I. He was the first Stuart, and even Mary Queen of Scots, who was executed, is buried in a vault under an elaborate tomb of her. Earlier kings are buried in many different places. For example, Robert the Bruce's body is buried in Dunfermline Abbey, but his heart is buried inside of Melrose Abbey. His embalmed viscera is believed to also be interred inside of a church in Dumbarton. There is only one real royal vault to the Scottish kings and queens, and this has been opened many times and has been subjected to a huge amount of desecration and destruction. Even the abbey where it sits today, Holyrood Abbey, next to the incredible palace of Holyrood House. But what is inside of this royal vault today, And what happened to the remains inside of it? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Holyrood Abbey is today a ruined abbey, and it was founded in the early 12th century by King David I of Scotland. During the 15th century, the guest house of the abbey became a royal residence, and then this later expanded to become the Palace of Holyrood House. The abbey has been ruined since the 18th century as the roof collapsed in 2 stages, and today it still stands without a roof on. But it was here that a royal vault existed, and still today it can be found in the corner of the abbey. This vault once contained the remains of many kings and queens. Originally buried in here was King David II, who was interred in 1371, and King James II was buried there in 1460. Others interred were Arthur, the Duke of Rothesay, Madeline of Valois, the teenage bride of James V, James, the Duke of Rothesay, Arthur, the Duke of Albany, King James V, the father of Mary, Queen of Scots, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, Margaret, the daughter of James VI, and Mary of Geldres, and a child of King James II. But during the Anglo-Scottish Wars, during the reign of King Henry VIII, the English attacked the abbey and they sacked it, and they broke into the royal vaults. They caused a huge amount of damage and they ransacked the burials, destroying many of the coffins and decoration inside of the vault. Later, a Protestant mob in 1559 did the same, breaking into the church and causing further damage, and they also destroyed the altars on this occasion. Because of the damage and destruction, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland decided to demolish the east end of the abbey's church, and the royal tombs and coffins were removed to a new burial vault which was constructed on the south side of the nave. But this would not be the end of the desecration. Towards the end of King James VII's reign, this vault was ransacked, and it was said that the contents of the vault were left in disorder, and it's presumed that the coffins and remains were scattered and left in a terrible way. One man who visited Holyrood in the 17th century and looked inside of the royal vault later claimed, in the month of January 1683 was discovered accidentally by removing some seats in the church of Holyrood, the vault on the south-east end of the church, where the body of King James V lies buried. John Keane and others in their chronologies, the Scots king tells us he was buried at Holyrood House, but the length of time and negligence had worse the particular place out of the memory of men. It was known to be him by an inscription on his leaden coffin. I had the curiosity to go and view the relics of the gallant prince. In the Pend of Cell there are 6 lead coffins. The first is King James V, who died in the year 1542, but Drummond of Hawthorndean is in the very end of his life tells us this is not the place where he was first interred, but that King Henry VIII's army, having defeated and defaced his tomb and monument, he was transported into this vault by King James VI and re-embalmed, which appears by the freshness of his body and the liquor about him. The second is his queen, Magdalene, daughter to Francis I, King of France, who died in 1537. The third is Henry Lord Darnley, father to King James VI and Queen Mary's husband, who was strangled in 1567. By his body he appears to have been a very tall, proper man. Others call this body Signor David Rizzio, the Italian musician. The fourth is Lady Jean Stuart, daughter to King James V and Countess of Agril, who died in 1587. The other 2 are some of their children. He later went on to state, "This was a humbling and mortifying sight, and a great instance and document of mortality and vanity of the world, all the glory of the sprightly prince being crowded into this lowly cell. Many ordinary persons have better burial places than what this restless prince got." He then, it's believed, looked inside the coffins too and claimed, "All the inhabitants of that dark wall have lean and pale cheeks, hollow eyes, fallen noses, and none of them wear the jewels and other deckings with which they glistened when they were of life. we must all rise again at the great day of accounts of kings of old but very meanly entombed. Because of the state of this royal burial vault, in 1898, Queen Victoria ordered a repair of the vault once and for all, and it was stated that the remains of the burial should have been given some dignity. Because of this, the remains were all collected up. They were placed inside of this new wooden box, presumably all mixed up. One thing to also mention is that the remains of Mary of Gueldres, the Queen of King James II, was actually interred inside the vault later in 1848, as they were moved from Trinity Church in Edinburgh. These were kept inside of separate coffins. Compared with the burial vaults of Westminster Abbey, the vault inside of Holyrood Abbey was desecrated many times and it was ransacked. The vault that stands today was created later, and this was subjected to a significant amount of destruction too. Inside of Holyrood Abbey, this vault still exists, and the bones have all been collected to be placed inside of one large coffin. Dunfermline Abbey dates back to the year 1128, and it was founded by King David I of Scotland. There have been an earlier monastery there, and over the first few decades of its foundation, the church received a significant amount of grants and endowments, and it became very wealthy. It became a place where pilgrims travelled, as it held the reliquary shrine of St. Margaret, who was buried here. Her remains were disinterred over the 150 years after her death for her canonization to take place, and her bones were then placed in a reliquary at the high altar. This was the first high-profile burial within the church, and her husband, King Malcolm III, was buried here before the construction of the abbey. But this place became a huge site of royal burial over the following centuries. King Duncan II of Scotland in 1094 was buried there, as was King Edgar in 1107. In 1124, Alexander I and his queen were interred within the abbey, and it was said of his burial that he was interred near his father before the great altar. David I was also interred within Dunfermline Abbey's royal vault, along with his queen Maud. He was also allegedly buried near his father, Malcolm III, before the great altar, in the pavement of the middle choir. Also joining him in this spot was Malcolm IV, who died at the age of 24 and had actually reigned for 12 years. Many other members of the royal family and nobility were interred inside of the abbey, including many of the Earls of Angus. In 1286, King Alexander III was buried, and his first wife, Margaret of England, was also buried here. Their sons would too be buried within a vault, and it was said about Alexander's tomb that he lies at Dunfermline alone in the middle part and is buried near the presbytery, whence when we see a multitude lamenting as much his sudden death as the desolation of the kingdom, they alone did not moisten their cheeks with their tears. One of the most prominent kings of Scotland, and a man considered heroic to many today, was Robert the Bruce, and he was buried there in 1329. He was buried in the choir on the site of the present parish church. His heart was buried at Melrose Abbey, and his bones do lie within Dunfermline, and allegedly were discovered during work inside of the church. After his burial, there was a number of other royal burials within the abbey, but with Dunfermline Abbey is the largest collection of medieval Scottish kings and queen burials. In July of 1793, following the first anniversary of the declaration of the French Republic that deposed the French monarchy, the new government ordered a decree that caused chaos. They wanted to punish the former kings and queens who they regarded as tyrants, and they wanted to also wipe the monarchs off the face of the nation and also from the memory of people. With this, the National Convention ordered the desecration and destruction of ancient royal tombs. At the time, the majority of these were inside of the Basilia of St. Denis, close to Paris, which had become a royal mausoleum. With this, groups raided the church and they stole the coffins of the former kings and queens. Also stolen were the visceral urns of the former monarchs. These contained the hearts and entrails of them, which had been cut out of their bodies following their death. The crypts were opened and the remains were taken out of the chapel, and they were dumped in large trenches which had been dug up. The corpses were thrown into these pits, and then the revolutionaries threw quicklime solution onto the bodies to decay them and to then dissolve the corpses quicker. Later, in 1817, the briefly restored monarchy sought to return the remains to the Basilia, and they could only find the lower parts of 3 corpses and the fragments of 158 members of the royal family were later placed inside of ossuaries inside of the crypt. There was very little left of the former kings and queens of France, but inside of the churches there were further desecration as monuments were stolen and smashed, and there was a huge amount of damage. It was an attack on the old order which had been overthrown, and some who witnessed the exhumations and the desecration were even shocked by what they saw. It was a symbol to end the monarchy and an attempt to wipe those from history, and one man who witnessed the events claimed that God would annihilate an entire race and scattered its buried ancestors, and he believed that this was what had previously been warned about in the Bible. The exhumations had been little documented over the years. They were spoke about a lot at the time, and they were a rather important event. The exhumations were performed whilst many officials looked on, and whilst a large crowd made up of many people from the former monks of the chapel to the staunch revolutionaries looked on. The corpses were removed from the sarcophagi inside of the upper church and then taken from the coffins. There was a brief examination to see what state the remains were in, and it was claimed that the majority of the ancient dynastic monarchs' corpses had been reduced to ash, but the later kings and queens of France had been well preserved, but there were some who, despite the embalming process occurred, were in a bad way. The Bourbon monarchs were known for being in a state, and it was said that the putrefied bodies of some emitted a malodorous black vapour that sickened workers before it was checked with vinegar and burnt saltpetre. Inside of the central Bourbon crypt, one of the first coffins opened and broken into was that of King Henry IV. Under the light of torches, the corpses were lifted out of the coffin, and the remains were said to have been very well preserved. It was classed as a miracle, and a cast was taken of his face, showing the deceased king's face with his beard full, his eyes shut, and his face looking as if he died just days before. The corpse of Henry IV was then briefly inside of the choir before it was dumped into the trench outside. There was one corpse which was left alone, though. This was that of King Louis XIV, Supreme's commander, Henry de la Tour d'Avrigny. He was considered at the time the greatest general, and his coffin was opened as the crowd wanted to pay their respects to him. His body was said to have been odourless and intact, and a drawing was made of his body. It had been wrapped in a shroud, and this was uncovered, and it showed the brutal wound that he had died from, a cannonball being shot into his stomach. But the sight of his body stirred up some patriotism along the revolutionaries. There were a number of pieces of the remains of the former monarchs taken. People pulled teeth from the dead and then later tried to sell them. One man who saw the chaos claimed that, "I had the pleasure of touching these venerable remains. I took his hands with a certain respect that I could not resist, as true a republican as I am." He later saw a soldier who lifted up one of the corpses and then cut a lock off the red beard. Things became violent inside of the crypts because of the anger that the kings and queens represented at the time. A woman approached one of the corpses and swore at it, and then kicked it, which was so brutal that it was knocked from the plinth where it was placed. The coffin of Marie de Medici, the second wife of Henry IV, was opened, and some bones were found inside of muddy water or liquid, and 2 workers scooped them out, and then insults were thrown at her remains for the rest of the day. People pulled pieces of her hair from her skull and distributed them, and they then turned to the body of Anne of Austria. Her casket was opened, and they found her putrefied body, which was wrapped in a thick red cloth. This was then displayed. Some people inside of the local area even began to collect royal voyagers' parts, and one man had taken a section of St. Louis's skull, the teeth of King Henry III, and the leg of Catherine de' Medici. 21 coffins had been broken into on the 16th of October 1793, and the remains were then thrown into a pit. One eyewitness claimed most of the bodies were decaying. A foul-smelling, thick black vapour was released, which they desperately tried to dispel with vinegar and powder that they had taken the precaution of burning, which did not prevent the workmen from feeling unwell and feverish, but without consequence. In total, 46 kings, 32 queens, and members of the royal family, totalling 170 people, had their tombs smashed open, coffins cracked open, and their bodies exhumed. All of them then had their bodies dumped unceremoniously inside of trenches outside of the church, and one trench was for the Valois and the other was for the Bourbons. A huge crowd gathered to witness the burial of the bodies, and the lime was poured into the grave to dissolve the remains quicker, but also to keep the smell down as the bodies stank. Later, the Basilia of St. Denis was reconsecrated, and as mentioned, the remains were attempted to be returned to the grave, but it was impossible to do this. The desecration of the royal tombs inside of France was a brutal and rough event, one which shocked and horrified many people, but also the corpses of a British king, James II, was targeted, and his corpse was taken away and dealt with, despite him not being a French king. No nation on earth went to the extremes that the French did to destroy the bodies of the kings and queens that reigned over them. It was a harrowing event. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.